Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this special edition of Extreme Health Radio. We're really excited that you tuned in today. Today is a special edition, Sunday, October 28th, 2012. My name is Justin, and we are currently broadcasting worldwide from Southern California. So thank you for joining us. Right now, we're doing about 3 shows a week on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. This is episode number 28, so you can find the transcription, the show notes, and all that good stuff at extremehealthradio.com/28. And if you have any questions for our guest or for me, you can send them to Justin at extremehealthradio.com, or you can call me at 949-391-7363, and I'll play your message to our guest on the air. This show is brought to you by the Vitamix Blender, and you can check that out at extremehealthradio.com/Vitamix, and you'll be able to get free shipping if you buy through us, and that will help us out, so that'll be really great. And also, before we get started with our guest today, Danny Roddy, I'm really excited about that. I'll tell you a little bit about our upcoming show schedule. We've got Amanda Love on October 31st. She'll be talking about the role of beneficial bacteria in the human gut and fermented foods and that kind of thing. We also got Norm Sheely, Dr. Sheely, on Friday. He's a prolific guy. He's really an amazing individual, written tons of books, and he sees people from all over the world. So you can check him out at normsheely.com. Then we got Dr. John Apsley. He's up in Seattle working with cancer patients, just doing all kinds of really cutting-edge research in cancer and disease. So that should be a fun show. And today we've got Danny Roddy, who's a health researcher, and he runs DannyRoddy.com, and he's a prolific guy, writes tons of great articles on his blog about hormones and the thyroid gland and hair loss. So we'll be talking to him about that. And so we're really excited to have Danny Roddy on. Thanks, Danny, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So you're a big fan of Dr. Ray Peat.
I'm a huge Dr. Ray Peat fan.
Yeah, I've kind of gathered that from reading your blog.
Yeah, I think we'll get into it, but I think he's probably 100 years ahead of everybody in the nutrition field. That would be my view on it.
Is he still alive, Ray Peat?
Yeah, he's 76, lives in Eugene, Oregon, and just is full-time, kind of studies physiology. Super nice guy. Occasionally will answer emails.
Wow, it's funny. I've been in the health world, really kind of full on since 2003. I've never heard of him until I read your work.
I think there's probably a good reason for that, or not a good reason, but I think his work is kind of, I don't know the best word, but probably it's people don't like saying that they read him, is what I found. And he's kind of, at least in kind of the main like paleo or like low carb universe, he's kind of looked at as a crackpot. So I can explain a couple of reasons why I stuck reading him, but he's more of a physiologist and less of like a health guru. Okay. So it's kind of hard to understand his work, or at least it was for me.
Yeah. In honor of today's show, I had a carrot for breakfast. Yeah, it wasn't very good, but I'm supposed to shred it, I read in your book.
Yeah, he talks about that in the 1930s, that women went on the carrot diet, and I've been trying to find more information about it, but the specific things that the women noticed measuring their hormones and after was that a single raw carrot a day would lower their estrogen, increase their progesterone, and decrease something called bacterial endotoxin, which is something that's constantly produced by bacteria in the stomach. And all those hormonal changes were positive, and they were getting it just by consuming a carrot a day. And what it was acting like was a natural antibiotic. And I know it sounds totally crazy that like something like a carrot could have that effect, but there's actually research on it, and it talks about how a carrot in the intestine, it doesn't really get digested, but what it does do is it stays in the intestine and it gives off an antibiotic-like effect that has a couple different mechanisms that influence hormones in a positive way.
That's wild. I was watching your videos, excuse me, and in your video about the straining of the orange juice, you were talking about, the fibers in the orange juice and, straining them out. And the carrot one, you said the fibers, can't be broken down. And that got me thinking, would carrot juice be better since in the orange juice video, you're talking about straining out the fibers, and then in the carrot video, you're actually, eating the fibers, and you said the fibers can't be broken down. So I wasn't sure about what, the role of fiber was.
The interesting thing about carrots is because they're an underground vegetable, they actually have, like, to survive, they give off this like antifungal effect. And so the difference between pulp from orange juice is it doesn't have that same antibacterial effect. So we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, and I'll provide context for why any of this stuff matters at all. But the carrot and peat often refers to bamboo shoots too, but those are two kind of special fibers that can have a quote cleansing end quote effect instead of like starch fiber and like these different types of fibers which have a largely negative effect, whereas the fiber from carrots and bamboos have like a positive effect. I know that can be kind of confusing.
Okay. So now what I like about your book, The Hair Like a Fox, is the fact that it almost gets down to, as far as hormones and hair loss, it seems like it gets more to the root cause than any other thing I've ever read in terms of why people are losing their hair and the physiology behind hormones and what's going on with the thyroid. It was just really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I started researching hair loss almost a decade ago just because I was losing a lot of hair at the time. And I kind of went through what every male would go through. I found the nearest doctor that prescribed Propecia, went to him. He's like, "Yep, you're losing your hair." And I was like, "Cool, give me a prescription for Propecia." And thought I was totally in the clear. I started taking it like within a couple months, like totally couldn't get an erection for like a 21 or 22-year-old guy, which was a huge problem.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like started learning a little bit more, and I found PropeciaSideEffects.com, and the site is just filled with people that just sadly are like ruined by this drug. And I started researching like the exact mechanism that Propecia had. And it was supposedly by decreasing this enzyme that turned testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of the nugget that we're sold by the pharmaceutical industry, that this is why men lose their hair. And if you want to do something about it, this is the only thing you can do. And because you have a genetic problem, and genetic problems require pharmaceutical drugs.
Always.
So I started learning about this, and actually a lot of my research is based on a super brilliant guy named Brian Simonis. And I actually don't know if I'm saying his last name right, but he runs a site called immortalhair.com. And we're very different, but he chooses to treat hair loss by supplements. But he was the first one that introduced me to the idea, like, there are a lot of other things going on in balding men than this supposed story that we're fed. And if all these other factors are at play, why is the pharmaceutical industry, or why is mainstream culture only obsessed with DHT when there are other hormones like estrogen or a mineral corticoid called aldosterone or prolactin? These all have been found to be elevated in the balding male, or those with quote male pattern baldness. So like, why isn't anybody paying attention to these things, and why is all the focus just on DHT?
Right. And so because your work takes into account the thyroid gland and the hormones, would this also help women too with their hair loss? Because I would imagine it's all hormone related, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. It's PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, is in a couple different papers I've read. It's referred to as like the male, or the same hormonal environment as those with male pattern baldness or androgenic alopecia. And the interesting thing is, like, women can get quote male pattern baldness. They can bald in a certain shape just like a male can. So it's like wow. This idea of male and like male problems like hair loss or female being separate, that's in the right hormonal environment, you can literally have the same thing happen to either sex. So I think it's especially important for women. I don't know who writes me more. It's probably 50-50, but I get tons of emails from women saying they're experiencing the type of hair loss that males experience.
Wow, that's crazy. So it's not just DHT, especially for men. And the DHT, from what I understand, and people, I'm like you, I'm losing my hair. So, I'm sure there's some sort of genetic, predisposition there, I guess. So DHT, is it something like, in my hair, would the DHT just be, kind of congregated around the hair follicles, or what kind of happens with the DHT?
A year ago, I think I would have said yeah, there's a hormonal predisposition, and there might be. Honestly, I don't really know. And I probably should have started this off. I'm just a guy that researches hair loss. I'm not a guru or an expert. And I always encourage anybody listening to this to do their own research and come to their own conclusions. But I think really in the right hormonal environment that pretty much anything can happen. So if you somehow pump somebody full of these hormones, I think, like in the case of like a prolactinoma, like I think you could cause male pattern baldness in almost anybody.
Really?
I'm not 100% like about the genes kind of idea. But it's just to where I've kind of naturally kind of drifted over to from a year, because I would have agreed with you about a year ago. But I'm pretty convinced right now, at least, that it's the hormonal environment that guides it. And I don't know, the mainstream idea is that the hair follicles are more sensitive to DHT, and thus people that are like more sensitive to DHT lose their hair, and people that aren't sensitive to it. But a lot of the hormonal factors that I'm suggesting are part of male pattern baldness are never tested. So it's really hard for me to come to like a finite conclusion of whether it's genetic or whether it has something to do with these hormones that have never been tested at all. Wow. If that makes any kind of sense at all. Yeah,
no, definitely. So you were a guy that on your website, you said that you've done like the paleo thing for a year, and you've done other diets for, long periods of time. So when you did the paleo diet, like the paleo thing seems to make a lot of sense, but what kind of things were you experiencing when you did the paleo thing for a year?
So even before that, so I started experimenting with my diet almost a decade ago, probably 7-8 years ago. And I was in a band that was signed to a major label. We were called Dakota, and we were signed by the same guy that signed the Killers and Fall Out Boy. So if you remember, those bands were just like gigantic at the time, and he worked at Island Def Jam. And so the label, our A&R guy, they were all like, "You guys are going to be huge," and all the dudes in my band had just like perfect like heads of hair, and I was losing my hair like crazy, and I was like, this is not going to happen. So, like I said, I got on Propecia, and that kind of didn't work out. So I found Brian's site, immortalhair.com, and I was like, this makes total sense to me. Like I saw Super Size Me. I know how food affects like your being and your physiology. And I started researching just 24/7. I was totally consumed with it. And so probably the worst thing I've ever done is like I immediately adopted veganism. And this like compounded all of my problems. And I did this for a year. Oh, wow. And I would consider myself a really good, quote, good vegan. And I only ate vegetables. I avoided literally like all fats. And I was probably eating just like a ridiculously low amount of food a day, probably like 1,500 calories a day. Wow. Everything was getting worse. And I felt just terrible. All I wanted to do was argue, and my bandmates hated me, and I hated me. It was just a bad time. And so I started going to bodybuilding forums, because at this period, paleo like didn't even exist yet. I think that was started kind of in 2007. Mm-hmm. And so I was researching on bodybuilding physiology forums, and I was like taking in as much as I possibly could from these guys that literally were doing steroids 24/7 or recovering from doing steroids. So I would make notes, and I'd try to put the pieces together, and I was like 100, I'm like 150 pounds, wasn't really interested in weightlifting, but these guys just talked physiology all the time. And one of the doctors they always referenced was named Dr. John Chrysler, and he seemed to know his stuff. And after a year of veganism, it felt like total hell, and I scheduled an appointment with him and flew out to Michigan to see him, and we ran my labs, and they were just horrible. I had super low everything. And he was like, what are you eating? And I was like, I'm a vegan. Eat the healthiest diet known to man. And he's like, you might want to rethink that. And so that was like the major strike of lightning I needed to kind of get out of my vegan universe and all the information I was like kind of reading just to confirm what I thought I knew. Uh-huh. And that's when I was like, maybe I'll reintroduce meat into my diet. And that's kind of when I went on to paleo, probably 2006 or 7, or I think Mark's Daily Apple, which is a huge paleo site, came out in 2007. Started doing that, and quickly from there was like, well, if low carb paleo is good, and I felt better after eating that for a certain amount of time, so my labs kind of got better, I was like, well, zero carb has to be better, so there was a guy at the time named Charles Washington who was championing a zero carb diet. And I was like, that sounds interesting. I really like meat, and I've already had beneficial effects from this low carb diet. Why don't I just go zero carb? So I did that for about 2 years. And first year was really great, and I think it had really positive effects on my hair. And I noticed I just felt better, and I liked kind of the idea of being weird and eating only one thing. But but after 2 years, it kind of started to wear on me. I looked pretty rough. And from there, I wrote my first book on hair loss when I started introducing potatoes into my diet. And once I started eating more potatoes, I kind of warmed up a bit, and I was like, okay, carbohydrates are valuable in the diet. And that's quick. Then I learned about Ray Peat, and he flipped my world upside down.
Wow. So the low carb, what kinds of things were you experiencing? I mean, you did zero carb. That's just, it sounds almost insane.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to look back on. I just remember feeling better than I did on veganism, because I just felt horrible anxiety. I couldn't sleep. And then when I think I was probably just super malnourished. And the thing I noticed about low carbing is I could control my body temperature, which I found later to be an extremely important factor in health. So I would eat really low carbohydrate, and it didn't matter how many calories I consumed. I would just be freezing. And I worked at a retail store at the time, and I worked in the back, which was especially cold, and I would just have 2 jackets on, and normal healthy people would be like, why are you so cold? And that was always kind of the differentiator of, I could feel when things weren't right, when I was frigid cold.
Oh my!
But that later I just found out was kind of a reflection of thyroid health. And while I think a lot of people visit my site and they're like, I'm experiencing hair loss, Roddy talks about thyroid. Thyroid hair loss is not the same as androgenic alopecia or male pattern baldness, but I really think androgenic alopecia or male pattern baldness is suggestive of total system failure almost. So I think they're all related, because I think a lot of people have a tendency to compartmentalize different ailments. And if you look at things from this sounds lame, but whole body perspective, or a whole organism way of thinking, stuff starts to kind of make more sense, and we can get into that.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, I want to talk to you about candida and carbohydrates and all that kind of good stuff, but also more on the thyroid. So we're with Danny Roddy. His website, if you're interested, is DannyRoddy.com, and he's got a couple of products there. One is Hair Like a Fox, and the other one is, I think it's called the Peat Whisperer. Is that right?
You got it. Yeah.
Yeah, two great books. So we'll be right back with Danny Roddy. All right, I hope you're enjoying this interview, whether you're out on a run or driving in your car or just listening at home. I appreciate it. I really, really appreciate that. And just wanted to take a quick minute to talk about a product called the H Miracle. And it's a hemorrhoid miracle. It's called Hemorrhoid Miracle. And you can find it at extremehealthradio.com/H Miracle, all one word. And I have the product myself, and I was told by my doctors a few years back during a routine colonoscopy, which I will not get anymore now that I know better. But during that colonoscopy, he found a couple polyps and removed them, said they were fine, and said that I had internal hemorrhoids, and that I think it's some incredible amount of people he finds internal hemorrhoids in, but most people can't feel them. So if you do have hemorrhoids, consider getting this book, because it's absolutely incredible. I highly recommend it. As you know, we only promote products that we strongly believe in, and I've actually used the information in this book to alleviate my symptoms. So it's really, really, I think, something that I stand behind, and it's valuable. And if you are dealing with such an issue, check it out. extremehealthradio.com/H Miracle. And you can learn more about it on that page and see if it's something for you. But before you get anything drastic done, definitely want to check that out. So, but if you're also interested, you can check out our our store for all kinds of awesome products. Everything from reading your own blood tests, which is very important to know how to do, how to make cultured food, digestive, improving your digestion products, products for your dogs and things like that, survival products, parenting and baby products, and all kinds of really, really high quality stuff I think you're going to like. So check out our store, and if you want to just make a donation, feel free. Anything you want to donate is much appreciated. You can donate as little as $1 if you'd like, and anything you want is so very much appreciated. This is a labor of love, this website, so we really want to promote good products and put out high quality content. And if you ever make purchases on Amazon, feel free to visit any one of our web pages and scroll all the way to the bottom, and you can click on the Amazon link, and whatever you buy at Amazon will help support us. We'll get a little commission. We won't make much on it, but every little bit helps, so we really appreciate that. And if you can't purchase on Amazon or don't want to buy any of the products, that's cool too. Just keep enjoying the show and consider following us on Facebook and Twitter and sending the links to your friends and all that too. So we'd really appreciate any support like that. That doesn't cost any money at all. So I just hope you're getting a lot of value out of this show. So let's get back to the interview here. All right, we are with Danny Roddy from DannyRoddy.com. And Danny, one of the first things that I thought about when I was reading your work, reading more about the carbohydrates and all that, was the candida thing. And I know a lot of the raw food. I come out of the raw food world, the vegan raw food, and somewhat entrenched in the paleo world as well. So just trying to figure out what kind of diet is going to be good for me. And I know that candida is a real problem for most people. So what's your take on the candida issue for people?
There are a couple researchers that Ray Peat often mentions in his work, and one of them, his name is Hans Selye. So what Selye did was he was one of the pioneers in stress, and he has numerous different books, but he said there was a symptom of being sick, and the symptom of this like stress-related sick condition was all the same kind of things that you would normally ascribe to candida or candida. So it would be like thrush on the tongue, puffiness, like poor digestion. And once this person with symptoms of poor digestion or like bacterial fungal overgrowth would increase their ability to produce energy, so like real biological energy, like from the thyroid gland or energizing the cells, that these things would usually disappear. So that aligns with the work of another doctor named Dr. Broda Barnes. And so candida is not like so much, or the idea was that it's not so much a problem that you have to get rid of, but it was the result of a systemic issue of kind of a slow metabolism that was like that accumulated these problems like candida and just a host of other issues. So the main thing I learned from all my like various health escapades was that all these different polarized positions were trying to battle different things. Like in the paleo universe, it's like blood sugar and cholesterol, and I have to like optimize these numbers and then I'll be healthy. And when I was a vegan, I read tons about candida and that it was I have to cleanse my body of this or that. And once I read more of Peat and his contemporaries' work, it was focusing on restoring the ability of the organism to produce energy. And again, real biological energy, not like hippie energy. And that this would restore the vitality of the organism just by kind of like a good way to think about it is, or like a perfect example of somebody producing a good amount of energy is like a small child who has like a high pulse rate. They're very warm, and their regenerative abilities are the characteristic of youth. So as you age, your ability to produce energy declines, and then that's when we start having all these problems. And I know that sounds super simple, but I think it's really as easy as that. So
in essence, the candida issue would kind of be moot if the body were systemically healthy and able to kind of burn through that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a focus. I think it's just a problem that's part of a much bigger problem.
I see.
I mean, just looking through the internet, like seeing quote success with protocols like super low carbohydrate or taking all these antifungals like oregano oil and just stuff like that. It's like, I'm not reading that people are super well after doing these things. And I mean, I went through it too. I was convinced I had candida and went on a no carb diet. And it seemed like my problems were getting worse over time, not better. So I had to rearrange my thought process and try to figure out what I thought was important, and just the coldness and low thyroid that kept coming up on test. I was like, maybe there's something to this.
So do you think that the thyroid, I think you mentioned this a little bit ago, but do you think the thyroid is the causative factor of guys that lose their hair or women, or it's part of a greater factor?
I think it's complex, because I look at it like the ability of the organism to produce energy and thyroid health has an inverse relation with these stress hormones. So the ability to produce energy is on one side, and then stress is on the other side. And anytime our ability to produce energy is hindered, we compensate with stress hormones. So, and the stress hormones that Peat talks about and Hans Selye talks about are different than the common stress hormones you'll hear just in the media or the paleo world. So these hormones are specifically serotonin, cortisol, adrenaline, aldosterone, prolactin, estrogen, and there are a couple other ones, but that's for the most part. And anytime we're under a significant amount of stress and we cannot meet that stress with increased ability to produce energy and overcome the stress, we have to compensate with these stress hormones. And the stress hormones that I found are all linked to hair loss. So they'll measure blood labs in these dudes with androgenic alopecia or male pattern baldness, and they'll have high levels of aldosterone, they'll have high levels of estrogen, they'll have high levels of prolactin. And once you have that data, how could anybody in their right mind say, well, it's only because of DHT, because these other hormones are associated with hair loss and they are increased in a stress state? I think the reasonable, rational thing to do would try to be to lower them, and the context for lowering them, at least the most sane thing I've heard, is to increase energy production.
So like for someone like me, I've lost quite a bit of hair since I was, in high school. Let's say someone who's completely bald, do you think it's possible to regrow a lot of hair if you if somehow we're able to get the perfect diet down and get it all worked out? Do you think that it's possible to regrow most of your hair if you've lost a lot of it?
That's a great question. I wrote Hair Like a Fox about a year ago, and I get emails every probably a couple a week or so, and people say like, hey, this stopped my hair loss, and that's about so much I've heard. Or some people will say like, oh, I've regrew some hair. I've never heard a bald person write to me saying they regrew all their hair or anything like that, and I would be skeptical even if they did write me that. But I think I don't know what's possible, and I think everything right now, at least in my research and how many people I've kind of influenced, is in its infancy. So I don't know what to expect in the future. I mean, I hope I can that can happen. I think it would take somebody who is really committed to getting their hormones measured and really figuring out what exactly their problems were. But I don't think I mentioned this, but I started quote coaching gentlemen of December of last year, and to kind of test my theories, and I would have them run very specific labs that I thought were associated with hair loss. And like, for instance, the idea that serotonin makes you happy or something like that. And I believe serotonin causes hair loss. So these gentlemen would run these labs, and far from being low, the serotonin values of these men would be very high. And in my kind of context, serotonin activates pretty much any hormone involved in hair loss, and probably is involved in hair loss itself. And all these men would have it come back high. So I think, like, I just started doing this kind of testing and trying to support my hypothesis, and I'll continue to do so in the future. So I just think it gets more and more interesting as I get more and more data back.
Wow. So what do you think about people doing topical things on there? Like, let's say it's natural, some people might massage their scalp, or they might, I don't know, rub some things like aloe vera, or, you know what I mean? Like sometimes people will do these natural things topically on their hair. What do you think? Do you think that does anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard of people rubbing like natural progesterone on their head, and that it helping, or like vitamin E. That's another anti-estrogen. I definitely think those things can help. I was never very into topicals because I was so convinced that it was a physiological, like, inside problem. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I don't think they're not helpful. I was always into the other side of things, I guess.
So do you think that, like, if someone had a baldness gene, if there is such a thing, let's say, and they had a perfect diet their whole life with no stress and that kind of thing, do you think that they would go bald at all, or do you think that they would still lose some? I guess it's kind of a hard question.
No, I see what you're saying. The things that really convinced me that it was our environment is, one, I think from some young age, I had the fear of losing my hair. I'd say from like 10 on. And I think my dad talked about a coworker one time and said he was like a bald idiot or something. And that it was ingrained in my head from like a super young age. And so growing up, I always noticed, like, even in high school, like I noticed like a receding hairline in my buddy. And I talked, in my retail job, I was so preoccupied with this, I would like ask older folks. I was like, you notice a lot of younger guys balding? And they're like, oh yeah. And so I think that from noticing my buddies bald, and then from testing or having these men test their hormones, just saying that it's or it's a gene, or it's like just this hormone, but everything else is okay. It's like, I can't convince myself of that anymore, because I've tested about 67 or so men just since I started December, like kind of mildly coaching. All these gentlemen have like massive problems. Like it's not just their hair, it's like their digestion, or it's like they have really bad anxiety, or they have like libido issues, and it's a huge overall problem. And I would suspect that for anybody losing their hair, and again, it's rooted in stress. And the reason why somebody's listening is like, well, why hasn't anybody thought of that before? It's because there are quote stress hormones that are thought of in a different context in our mainstream. So the idea that like serotonin is the happy hormone and the estrogen protects your bones, these ideas are propagated by the pharmaceutical industry, and it's in people, or at least the research I've seen, it's hard for them to interpret the physiological functions of these hormones because they're so differently ingrained in our culture. So like research will clearly say that something negative about serotonin, but at the end of the PubMed article, it will say something positive about it. But it's just kind of wacky science, I think. But these researchers that were pre-pharmaceutical back in the 1950s, like Peat and Hanselje, they clearly demonstrated that serotonin was a stress hormone, that estrogen was the hormone of shock, or a very pro-stress hormone. And then when the pharmaceutical industry has billions of dollars at stake promoting serotonin as an antidepressant, or estrogen as the quote female hormone, the interpretation of these hormones got totally ass backwards, and like a lot of people don't think about them in the same way as these 1950s researchers. Yeah,
that's interesting. So it's almost it's almost a good thing to look at people who are doing research before the whole pharmaceutical industry, because they have just completely ruined research and studies and tests. You can't trust anything anymore with these people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to interpret anything from anybody. Like, I don't think if I was me today listening to this conversation, I don't know how much of it I would trust. This is just where I naturally ended up after like a decade of research, and makes the most sense to me now. But it was also because I think I had my prolactin tested in like 2004 or something. Even before I knew anything about health, somebody said prolactin might have something to do with libido, and I had a real low libido at the time, and I just got it measured, and it was high. And so I think it's just my journey somehow. I had these hormones in mind, and I kept learning about them, and then when I found Ray Peat's work, I had proper context for them, and then was able to test and see that different diets had different effects on these hormones, and formed kind of a hypothesis about what was actually going on.
And you know what's cool about the work on the thyroid and the hormones is that, you know, someone may be listening to this and they've got a great head of hair and they're blessed in that way, which is great, but having proper thyroid health doesn't it just about everything, which directly affects your hormones, but then after that, it's sort of the master switch for everything, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Pete calls it the basic anti-stress hormone. And a lot of the idea that the adrenals the adrenal glands are more important. Pete kind of, his work kind of suggests that that's not true, but I really do think the active thyroid hormone triiodothyronine, or T3, is the basic anti-stress hormone. I think physiologically it makes sense. It's a cofactor for your cells to produce energy. And then if you think about the organism's ability to produce energy being the most important thing for reinforcing the structure in your every part of you, it makes kind of more sense in that context. At least that was kind of what helped me wrap my head around it.
Wow, that's fascinating. We'll be right back. We're with Danny Roddy, and his website is DannyRoddy.com. And we'll be right back. We're going to talk a little bit more about hormones and thyroid and his work on called the Peat Whisperer. So that should be pretty good stuff. So stay tuned. Hey there. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to tell you about the best alternative cancer treatment book on the market today. It's called Cancer Step Outside the Box. And you can check that out at extremehealthradio.com/cancer. And it's written by Ty Bollinger, and we've had him on our show. He was our very first episode. He's written a prolific book on cancer, talking about all of the natural cancer treatments that are out there that are on the cutting edge. Some of them have a 93% success rate. He gives you, inside the book, which is like 400 pages, he walks you through all of the natural cancer treatments that are the most effective. He's got all kinds of cutting edge research on why chemotherapy just does not work, how to heal the body, how to cleanse the body, many different ways of cleansing. And he's got entire protocols of all the most popular and powerful treatments to beat cancer. Some of them even in the stage 3 area. I highly recommend this book. If you know someone who has cancer, or if you've been diagnosed, please get this book. It's really incredible information. You can check that out at extremehealthradio.com/cancer. And if you're interested in products like this, we've got tons of them in our store. So visit our store on our website and you can find out a lot of other products that are just like this. So thank you for listening. Let's get back to this interview. All right, we are with Danny Roddy from DannyRoddy.com. So Danny, I got to ask you, do you stick to the hair like a fox diet pretty good, or do you kind of veer off, or what kinds of things do you eat?
Yeah, if I could, I am rewriting that book, but if there's one thing I could try to get across as strong as possible, it's not so much a diet as a way to quote optimize your hormonal physiology and suppress hormones that I think are cause hair loss.
Okay.
So I think you could adhere to that diet like 100%, and I think if people will write me and like, hey, I'm doing this, and this, I'm still losing hair. And I'll go like, did you get any labs? And they'll be like, no. And like, do you ever measure your pulse? No. Do you ever measure your body temperature? No. Are you aware of any feelings in your body? No. So I think eating is important, but I think being aware of your situation, like your pulse rate or your body temperature, or being cold in your extremities, or just your general level of stress. And if you're really into it, I think getting a couple labs is like extremely helpful. And I think when you do that, you have more of an idea what to eat. Like, I need to increase my carbohydrate consumption, or I need to eat more protein, or like I need to eat more saturated fats. And I think once you have these kind of self-diagnostics, things are much more clear. So I think I make that a little bit more clear in the Peat Whisperer, and I try to do that as much as I can in my writing, but sometimes people just get the book or something like that and it won't be as clear. But I don't think there's like a diet that will just do everything and you don't have to worry about it. I think it takes a little bit more work with self-diagnostics to really figure it out and kind of perfect it.
So if people want to contact you to check their blood, and I think at the end of your book, you mentioned a website where people can get their blood tested, or how does that work if people want to do that?
Yeah, actually, I had a free, or I do have free coaching right now, and the only caveat was that I wanted specific blood tests. So if the person listening were willing to get their serotonin, a couple other tests I have on my website, if you go to DannyRoddy.com/coaching, we could go over kind of anything you wanted to go over if you were to provide me with those labs. And I've just been getting so much email. It's been hard to write and do everything that I do and coach at the same time. But if anybody wanted to write me that was interested in that, we could do that. But right now it's totally free. I'm just trying to accumulate more information and better support my hypothesis. I'm really not concerned with money right now or anything like that.
We're like little guinea pigs to you, huh? Like the clinical trials.
Justin, you are my guinea pig. Yeah.
We got a new drug coming out. We'd like to try it out on you. So the Peat Whisperer, I wanted to talk about that because that seems really interesting to me. I've been, recently doing a lot of, look into stress, and it's amazing how when you think about everything that we have in our life, I mean, I've just been thinking about most people have stress like in their job, or, you might have stress with something with work or something like that. But really stress can be just about anything, couldn't it? I mean, like eating something bad, or, it could cover just about everything that makes our body work harder, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think some people are like, oh, just psychological stress or something like that, or they have like a very specific idea of what stress is. But like you said, just like an allergen or something you eat wrong or something that's hard to digest, that can be a stress. And that can like initiate a hormonal cascade, which increases a couple different inflammatory stress hormones. And the worst part about it is because of our diet, the hormones potentiate each other, and it's like a big circle, and they all keep increasing each other until you can kind of break out of the stress. So for some people, just changing their diet will be enough. For some people, increasing salt intake will be enough, or increasing sugar intake or protein. But some people need like thyroid, or some people need progesterone, or some people need like pregnenolone. It just depends on what works and what doesn't. But it's kind of the idea of self-experimentation. It's
wild. I heard a while back. Are you familiar with a guy by the name of Ogenius Vonderplanitz?
Yeah, very, very familiar.
Yeah. Well, he mentioned one time that you could sort of reset your thyroid gland by eating, doing this blended smoothie, which sounds disgusting. Have you heard of this thing?
Not specifically. I do know what was in the smoothie. Eating thyroid that is like taking similar to Armour thyroid, but I don't know about now because Armour is reformulated, but eating the thyroid gland could be therapeutic because it would literally increase thyroid production.
Yeah, he talks about in this smoothie, it's like, I don't even know what it is. It's like a raw goat's milk, raw honey. Let's see, I think there's a thyroid gland in there, liver, a couple other organ glands, and you basically just blend this thing up. I imagine you put a lot of honey in that thing because it wouldn't taste that good. But
no, I think,
but he claims that, I mean, who knows? But he claims that, this thing, he's tested people before it and after it, and it will reset your thyroid for a matter of 12 months to 16 months or something. I don't know what that means, but I just thought it was interesting.
Those foods are actually the ones Peat has recommended and I've parroted, but calcium has an extremely positive effect on the thyroid. So if you tolerate milk well, I think that's really excellent, and that will suppress stress and promote thyroid. Honey, carbohydrate, especially like a sugar-based one with fructose and sucrose, would support thyroid production. Liver, eaten once or twice a week. The vitamin A content is really supportive of thyroid. The copper is really supportive of thyroid, the B vitamins. The trouble, I think, is getting the thyroid gland nowadays is extremely difficult. So I think it would depend where you lived. But I know I couldn't get thyroid pretty much anywhere. But I guess it depends how hardcore you are.
Yeah, if you can stomach that thing. But so what do you think about things to reduce stress, like exercise or yoga or meditation, things like that? Are those things good?
Yeah, I think yoga and meditation are probably excellent. Exercise is a stress, so I think cardio would be counterproductive, whereas like weightlifting for brief periods of time would probably be very protective. But like really simple things you could do to reduce stress is, like we talked about, like the daily raw carrot would be super simple. If you go into Google and type Danny Roddy raw carrot, I think you'll get my video on how to make the Dr. Peat's carrot salad. Mm-hmm. But I think starting at something like that and then moving forward is easier than me suggesting a complete rearrangement of your diet or anything like that. But milk, orange juice, things like that, like and anything like beef and oysters and liver and things like that are very anti-stress.
It's wild because the stress and your thyroid, I mean, it affects your libido, it affects your hair loss, it affects energy levels. I mean, it's a crazy how many things that go along with the thyroid and stress and hormones. And, you can go out and, be really, really stressed and all of a sudden you've got some gray hairs. I mean, it's just crazy. So I imagine that stress, if you could manage your stress in an effective way through diet and lifestyle, that would probably be really, really good in terms of your disease prevention and, how long you live and all that.
Totally. The reason why I think Peat is so ahead of everybody, and I think he's so dead on, is he focuses on health from like a cellular point of view. And once you do that, it's really, it's not like, what did our ancestors eat? And then try to like base your diet off of that. Yeah. If you optimize the known factors that promote the cell's ability to produce energy, and carbon dioxide, which is another factor just never addressed in health, that from the cell, it builds up to your organs and you. So it's not about what your ancestors ate or about like the most ethical diet. It's about your cells and the health of your cells. And a lot of the research from the 1950s, like from Otto Warburg and his research on cancer, he found that just the cells were defective and would produce a lot of pro-inflammatory lactic acid. And correcting the health of the cell, I think it's really brilliant of Peat's ideas, because it really kind of bypasses a lot of the junk science and the ideas that are kind of populate the mainstream and kind of get to what I would consider more important issues.
It's interesting that, a lot of people these days obviously are looking into the ancestral diet and all this kind of stuff. And I've always had kind of an issue with it because, for me at least, it seems like our ancestral diet, let's say we were meant to be vegetarians, let's say, either we evolved to be, vegetarians or God created us that way, whatever the deal is. So, but then let's say for the last, 100,000 years or however long, we ate meat. And then so the people in the paleo side say, oh, well, we were eating meat for 200,000 years. This is what we're supposed to eat. But really, it's not really true because, we're eating something that we weren't designed to eat, or, you know what I mean? So it seems like the ancestral diet, I don't know, it just doesn't, it seems like there's problems with it. Don't you think?
No, I think there's massive problems with that. And you can see that in the community itself. The community, whether they like to admit it or not, started as like very low carb, ketogenic side of things. And then over the years, like there were major players in the paleo sphere that jumped ship and started doing different things. So not only I think it's the context faulty, but if you kind of monitor that scene, you'd see all those defunct paleo people going on to different things. I think I'm one of them. And also the flip-flop nature of somebody saying, oh, fructose is a toxic poison, and then 6 months later saying, it's not so bad. And this is, I think, a direct result of their kind of faulty context of trying to mimic the quote hormonal state or of our ancestors, which nobody knows and is just, I think, total dead end. from my point of view.
Yeah, I think so too. Because I mean, imagine if you were to extrapolate, sort of just manipulate time and say, if we can go back, say 100 years when processed food came out, you were able to fast forward time for 100,000 years from now, and you could say, okay, from 1900 to whatever year that was in the future, we ate processed food, so that must be our diet. But I mean, it's no good,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things wrong with it, and that's kind of why I started reading Peat, and then people in the paleo community were like, "Danny, you've gone wrong. Like, you shouldn't be reading this." I literally would get emails telling me I was wasting my time, from people that graduated from very prestigious universities. And I kept reading them because he talked about hormones that I had always been interested in and that were related to hair loss. And at first it was like total Greek to me, and then I just kept reading him, kept writing about him. And I mean, I've gotten a lot of things wrong on my website, but I think I've learned so much over time that I'm just really excited about learning more about Peat's work, learning more about Cellia's work, learning more about St. George's work, and all these Otto Warburg's work, that all these really great scientists that had really great ideas back in the before 1945, 1950 that were kind of more pro-science as to after that, the advent of pharmaceuticals, and we have a product to sell, and we're going to influence physiology in a negative way and things like that. So
is the Peat Whisperer that's on your website, and people can purchase that if they like?
Yeah, when I wrote Hair Like a Fox, that was kind of my first foray into Peat. And then people were like, "Hey, Roddy, how about writing a book that's not specifically focused on hair loss?" So I worked on the Peat Whisperer, and I wrote to Peat telling him I was writing it. All proceeds, like 10% of proceeds, are donated to him. That was just because I was totally fascinated with him, because he's the most humble, coolest guy ever. And now I'm going back to Hair Like a Fox, kind of tweaking that and going back to kind of what started me in this and figuring more of that out.
Does Dr. Peat give interviews?
Yeah, he does. He's you could write an email to him. He's super nice. He responds really quickly, but he's done a bunch of different interviews that you can find. I think KMUD, and he's done interviews with a guy named Josh Rubin, but reading him is one thing, and then listening to him is a completely different animal. But I think just listening to him, you'll kind of, at least I did, I realized, I was like, this guy's not like anybody else, and I think he really has a good idea of what's going on.
Wow, so he's kind of cutting edge in terms of health. A lot of people aren't really into his work, and is that just because of just what he's touching on as far as hormones, or like why do you think people in the paleo and maybe in the raw food world wouldn't like Peat?
I think I think mainly the reason I was always told was, or people wrote to me and said, was originally when paleo came out, it was just extremely low carbohydrate, and carbohydrates cause disease, and that's when Tobbs was at the height of his popularity. And once people were like, oh, maybe carbohydrates don't cause disease, maybe restricting them too much is not the greatest thing, and and everybody has different tolerance for carbohydrates, maybe it's the fructose and the sugar that's really the problem. And so now we've gone through a year or two of complete fructose phobia. And if you go through paleo blogs from those years, it's just all about how fructose is a total poison, it's toxic. Lustig's presentation is gigantic. And from there, Peat was always advocating sugar in the form of fruit, and that was very unpopular when I started learning about him. And then me and I think a couple other people kind of kept reading him and kept writing about him. And I think he's, just by my website stats, I think he's getting more popular and more people are writing him. But I think just he was so counter low carb culture that I think that's what made him very unpopular. And he did things like eating ice cream and drinking orange juice, and these things were just like thought to be completely incompatible with health at the time. But nobody understood his context. Or at least I didn't think, it didn't seem like a majority understood his context for why he was doing the things he was doing.
Wow.
So I think once you ditch the ancestral idea of health and adopt his context, or like research his context, I think things make a lot more sense.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I definitely want to look more into him. And so with your work, where are you headed with your website and your writings and all that?
Great question. Like I said, I was going back over Hair Like a Fox, kind of rewriting that with all the data I've been receiving. Just like reading every day, reading a lot of Peat's, I guess, mentors or the people Peat read. So St. Georgiana Warburg, Gilbert Lang, and trying to I don't know, just learn every day pretty much. I don't think there's really any rhyme or reason to the articles I write except what interests me at the time. There's a lot of articles up there if you want to read through them, and I don't think anybody should feel very compelled to buy anything from me. I think just reading those articles, you'll get a good understanding of where I'm coming from. But also I created specifically because I get so many emails having me explain just very fundamentals of what I was trying to get across. If you go to DannyRoddy.com and go to diet on the top, which really should be philosophy, but more people clicked on diet. So if you click on that, you can sign up for an email series, and that will contains like 8 emails of I think really need to know like kind of basic information. And I think that's probably the best way to kind of get started or learn about kind of this philosophy of eating.
Wow, that's fascinating. All right. Well, thanks, Danny, for being on the show today. I appreciate it. Would you mind holding on while I close out the show?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, awesome. All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. I really hope you benefited a lot from this interview. I thought it was fascinating. Dr. Ray Peat sounds like a real fascinating guy. And Danny Roddy, I'm glad that he's putting out his work, so touching on his information. If you got a lot of valuable information out of this show, I would appreciate it if you could send the link on to your friends, or maybe click like on Facebook or follow us on there or whatever. That would be great. We're really kind of relying on you guys to help spread the show here, so we appreciate that. And also, we have a store on our website. Check out our store. We've got lots of great products on there, physical products and digital products as well. And I think we have Hair Like a Fox on our store too. So check that out. If you'd like to donate, we accept donations. We're 100% listener supported. So feel free to do that. We would be greatly appreciative of any